Yo, what's up everyone? Welcome to Small World and thank you for joining me with today's video. In this episode, I'm going to show you how I built and painted this realistic miniature house diorama. This project was super simple and easy to make, but I'm pretty happy with the way it turned out. Let's get started with the build. First, I designed the model in CAD and I printed off some elevation drawings of the walls. I start by cutting out holes in the template for all of the windows and doors. Next, I cut out the front wall along with two side walls from black foam core. The template gets placed over top of the foam board and I mark out the placement of each window and door using a pencil. Next, the windows and doors are cut using an X-Acto knife. This step is pretty time consuming as each cut may require multiple passes with the blade, but eventually the foam in place of the windows and doors should just pop out. I also decided to add a window to each wall on the sides, and after cutting all of the holes, I test fit each window to make sure everything is cut to the proper size. I'll show you how I made these windows later on in the video. Then I assemble each wall at the corners using some foam safe superglue. Now it's time to add the siding, and I'm using some Clapboard basswood sheets with a 1/4 inch spacing. I start by laying the piece over the wall and using a pencil to mark out where to cut the wood. I also use the pencil to mark out where each window and door will be placed on the wood siding. I use my X-Acto blade to cut the siding where I marked with the pencil, and then I use a T-square and a pencil to fully define where the windows and doors will be. Then I just simply cut along those lines to make holes for the windows and door. The basswood is pretty dense and thick, so it's a bit difficult to cut through and it requires multiple passes with the blade. Thankfully, these cuts don't need to be 100% perfect. Any small gaps between the cut siding and our windows will be covered with trim. This will make sense later on. Here, I'm cutting out a large rectangular piece below the door for the brick staircase that will be added later. Now that the piece is cut, I glue it to the foam core using some foam safe super glue and white glue. Once it's installed, I just repeat these steps until the entire facade is covered in siding. After the facade is finished, I add some siding to the sides of the building. Here's how the model looks once the siding is applied. It looks pretty bare at the moment, but it'll look better once we layer on all the detail. But now it's time for paint. I use a cheap chip brush with some white acrylic craft paint. I apply the paint in a really thick coat and the brush strokes help resemble the wood grain texture. Just make sure to brush in the direction of the wood grain. This is the same white acrylic paint that I used on my old cabin diorama, but we won't be peeling and weathering it this time. The next step will be making and installing windows, but now is a good point to thank Elegoo for sending me one of their new machines to try out. Elegoo reached out to me and sent me the Saturn 4 Ultra to use for this project, and it performed really well for me. This printer is like a much larger Mars 5 Ultra, which you've seen me use in my Waffle House diorama. The Saturn 4 Ultra has a lot of similar features, such as an auto-leveling build plate and a tilting resin vat, but it also features a flip-top lid which is really nice. For this project, I 3D modeled and printed all of the window frames using the Saturn 4 Ultra, along with some shutters, a door, window trim, and other small details. I think the printer performed really well, and all of the details turned out really nice. With all of the parts printed, I primed them using some Duplicolor primers, starting with white for the trim pieces, columns, and window frames. For anyone that's curious, I design and 3D model nearly everything that I 3D print for all of my projects. If you have a 3D printer or access to one and would like to print these files for yourself, they're available for download on my Patreon. The door was painted a Colonial red color by Rust-Oleum, and the shutters were sprayed with a Duplicolor black primer. Even though the window frames and trim were sprayed white, I decided to hand paint them with acrylic paint for a couple reasons. One being that the white of the primer and the white of the paint on the house don't match really well, and another reason being that brush painting on the 3D printed pieces add that wood grain texture along the window frames and trim. I know some of you may be thinking I might fill in the details on the muntins of the window frames by brush painting, but as long as you're careful around those parts, they'll turn out just fine. I brush paint in the direction that the wood grain would be to build up the texture on the window frames. This is exactly what I did for my Wild West diorama, but we won't be weathering them this time. I just continue to paint the rest of the details white. Once dry, the window frames get scored with an X-Acto blade to indicate the seams. This is a really small and subtle detail, but I think it adds lots of realism to the windows. For the glass, I'm using a clear acetate sheet and I apply some foam safe superglue to the back of each window frame and stick them in place on the sheet. I'm using foam safe superglue because it doesn't fog the acetate like normal superglue would. After gluing all of the frames to the acetate sheet, I cut away the excess acetate using a sharp X-Acto blade. I use more superglue to combine the frames in order to make a double hung window. I glue the sides of the window to a piece of 1/4 inch wide balsa wood and I cut away the excess. I flip it over and repeat for the other side, along with the top of the window too. For the bottom sill, I use a wider 3/8 of an inch piece. And this is how one of the completed windows look. I just repeat this step for the rest of the windows. After making all of the windows, I press them into place on the model. As I mentioned earlier in the video, don't worry if you have small gaps between the window and wood siding. We'll cover those up soon. The fit for these windows was really tight, but I still added a few drops of superglue on the backside off camera to each window. Now it's time to add the trim, and I start with the 3D printed molding on top. Then I use some 1/32 by 1/8 inch basswood strips for the sides. 1/16 by 1/4 inch strips are added to the bottom. The door has some 3D printed trim installed along the sides. More wood trim is added to the corners of the building using some 1/32 by 1/8 inch and 1/32 by 3/16 inch strips. Here's how the building looks so far, and as you can see, we've already added lots of detail with the windows and trim. For the base of the roof, I use a 1/16 inch thick piece of chipboard cut to the appropriate size. I make the dormers by cutting out a sheet of basswood and some leftover clapboard siding. The siding gets glued together at the corners and I paint the whole thing white. The window gets pressed into place like earlier and I add more basswood trim to hide the gaps. Any unpainted trim gets a coat of white paint. After the paint dries, I glue each dormer in place on the chipboard roof. Then, more chipboard pieces are cut and added to the top of each dormer. This is how they look installed. Now it's time to make some brick details using pink foam. I cut out all of these pieces on my hot wire cutter and I use them to make a staircase and chimney. It's been quite a while since I've carved and painted bricks on the channel, but this process is still the same. I use a ruler and I mark the pieces in 1/8 inch intervals, which is the height of each brick. Then I use a ruler and a sharp blade to score all of the lines across the foam pieces. After all of the horizontal lines are scribed, I scribe the vertical lines to indicate the individual bricks. Each brick is 3/8 of an inch long and make sure that the corners end alternating between full bricks and half bricks. I add some rougher texture using a ball of aluminum foil. You can skip this step if you'd like, but I wanted these bricks to look a bit older and worn. The brick lines are rescribed using a mechanical pencil to widen the gaps, which helps them look more realistic. Here's how the brick pieces look before painting. I base coat the brick pieces with a light burnt umber color, doing my best to cover up all of the pink underneath. To be honest, you can really paint your bricks any color you want. Bricks come in all sorts of colors, ranging from bright reds to dark browns. I'm going for a more brownish look with this piece. I mix some black into the burnt umber color, and I go back and paint individual bricks after the base coat has dried. Then I mix burnt umber with white, and I paint individual bricks with the lighter shade. I know it looks kind of weird and off right now, but you kind of just need to trust the process at this stage. Now I take some spackle and I smear it into all of the mortar joints. This is my favorite part of the process, and I think it adds a ton of realism almost instantly. Any excess spackle is wiped away using paper towels, and this process gets repeated for all of the brick parts. I give the bricks a highly diluted wash of Vallejo buff, which makes the bricks look dusty, and it tints the mortar joints to be an off-white color. I know it looks really yellow when it's being applied, but it dries to a much more subtle finish. I glue the chimney in place with some foam safe super glue, and I add some ceramic stucco acrylic paste on top of some basswood to make the landings of each step for the staircase. Then I paint the pieces with a gray color once the ceramic stucco dries. I glue the foam brick steps to the bottom of each wood piece using foam safe super glue. Next, each step gets glued together to form the staircase. Here's how the staircase turned out, and I just glue it to the facade. Moving on to the shingles, I mark out rows on a piece of 1/32 inch thick balsa wood spaced 3/4 of an inch apart from one another. Each line is lightly scored with an X-Acto blade. Then I flip the piece and cut strips that are 5/16 of an inch wide. In the past, all of my shingles were replicating old, weathered, dilapidated buildings. Being that this is supposed to be a cleaner build, I try to keep the shingles a more consistent size. After cutting all of the strips, I just snap the individual shingles on the score lines that I made earlier. This may seem time consuming, but it actually goes by pretty quick. Next, I apply superglue to the chipboard roof, and I stick individual shingles on one at a time. This isn't going to look perfect, but I'm doing my best to apply them in a neater pattern than I have in the past. I make sure to apply them to the dormers and to cut the shingles at an angle where they meet the roofline. Some trim is glued where the dormers meet the roof, and then a roof cap is made from angled styrene and is glued into place on top of the dormers. Some trim is glued on top of the roof, and then all of the shingles get a coat of diluted matte Mod Podge, which soaks into the wood and makes it more resilient. Here's how the shingles look after they're all applied. Individual shingles surely aren't the most time-effective method, but I think the results are worth it. I stain the shingles with an acrylic wash made from a mix of black and brown paints. I know it looks super dark, but it'll dry quite a bit lighter. The shingles can really be stained in lots of colors. References show shingles that have a light brown color, a darker brown color, or a more gray color depending on how old they are. I'm going for a more dark brown color with this house, but again, the color when wet is much darker than what the final look will be. If you're unsure about how the color of your wash will look, be sure to test the effect on scrap pieces of balsa wood before applying it to your project. I took my time when applying the washes because I wanted to avoid getting it on the white surfaces or the windows. While the stain was drying, I glued the 3D printed shutters to the facade using super glue. The only thing for this step is to make sure that the shutters are glued going in the proper way, with all of the louvers pointing in the same direction if you want a consistent look. For the portico, I start by gluing some thick basswood strips around a piece of PVC foam board that I cut out, and then I glued it to a slightly larger piece of PVC board. I apply some dollhouse molding along the edges of the larger PVC sheet. Then, some 3/16 and 1/8 inch basswood strips are glued around the piece to add some more detail. You could make this more detailed and fancy if you'd like, but this looked good enough to me. Then, the whole thing gets painted with the same white acrylic craft paint that we used to paint the house earlier. I 3D printed a small door handle and I super glued it to the front door using tweezers. The columns are glued on top of the staircase, and then the portico is glued on top of the columns and to the facade. Some additional 3/16 inch basswood strips are glued along the edges of the rooftop. Moving on to the base, I mark out some lines for the pathway leading up to the house. The top surface of the base is some more PVC foam board. I mark out some more lines horizontally, and then each line gets scored with the blade. I glued some 120 grit sandpaper to a scrap piece of foam, and I used a straight edge to texture my broomed concrete finish into the walkway. I used the same method to add texture to the sidewalk of my Waffle House diorama. It's important to use a straight edge, otherwise the effect will look messy and not realistic. Then, the surface gets painted with some gray acrylic washes. Once the path dries, I glue the house down to the base. After taping off the pathway, I paint the rest of the base with some brown acrylic paint. This step doesn't need to be perfect, I only do this to prevent any white from showing through the next few steps. Next, I apply some real dirt to the base. I use some finer dirt up against the house, since that's the dirt that you're going to be able to see. The rest of the base is covered with really rocky and coarse dirt. The larger stuff is definitely a bit too large for the scale, and you could sieve it out if you'd like. But it doesn't really bother me because all of this will be covered in grass, and the roughness actually helps add some nice natural irregularities to the lawn. When the dirt is all in place, I soak the surface with isopropyl alcohol, which helps break the surface tension. Immediately after, watered down matte Mod Podge is added, and I'm being sure to completely soak the surface. I know it looks terrible right now, but it'll look great once it dries. The next day, after everything has had lots of time to dry, I tape off areas around the house where I don't want grass. Then, I brush on a heavy layer of matte Mod Podge everywhere else. I use some 4mm static grass with my static grass applicator and cover up all of the glue. This process gets repeated for the other side of the lawn. You can also work in sections if the glue dries too quickly, but that wasn't necessary for this piece. After applying the grass, I tip the base over and shake off the extra grass onto some paper. I then save the extra grass by dumping it into a bag later on. You can also use a vacuum with a stocking over top to collect the loose grass. The tape is then peeled away from the dirt and the concrete pathway to reveal crisp and clean lawn edges. I was a bit worried that the tape wasn't down strong enough to create clean lines, but this ended up working great, and any visible white glue will dry clear. Here's how the model looks with the grass in place, and all that's left to do is add a few bushes from Diorama Precipe into the dirt. I just add a few dots of matte Mod Podge and simply stick the bushes in place. And with that, the model is finished. This model was super fun and easy to make, and I'm pretty pleased with the results. I know it's not my most detailed build, but more simple builds like these are nice breaks to do between more involved builds, like the Waffle House model. Projects like this are great for beginner model makers too, in my opinion. And I have a few large builds planned for this year that I'm really excited for. I also want to give a big thank you and shout out to all of my awesome Patreon members. Thank you so much for directly supporting me and my work, and please know that your generous contributions directly fund these models, and it means the world to me. If you'd like to support me and join my Patreon, check out the link in the description. Depending on what tier you select, you'll have access to behind the scenes updates of whatever project I'm working on, as well as exclusive Q&A videos, 3D print files, PDFs of graphics and architectural drawings for this project and previous ones, and much more. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.